Briefly, I'm going to read the speaker's biography before I welcome him to start the presentation. So Professor Eliseo Macamo is a professor of sociology and African studies at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He is currently working on how to think about African studies as a methodology of the social sciences. So the topic is post-comparative area studies, reversing the gaze and the moral ecology of knowledge. So the Revising the Gaze project explores what happens when concepts developed in African or other non-European contexts are used to understand European societies. Instead of comparing regions, he compares the moral work of concepts themselves, that is, how they travel, prescribe, and judge. He proposed two related ideas, namely a moral ecology of concepts, which treats concepts as living in environments of facts and values, and communities of virtue, which describe how people everywhere respond to uncertainty by reaffirming essential categories of belonging. By tracing how retribalization reappears in Swiss political life under new gazes, he argues that reversing the gaze is not an act of epistemic revenge, but a contribution to a more plural, responsible, and reflexive science. Thank you so much, Eliseo Macamo. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mercy, for the kind introduction. And of course, I thank you all, especially Professor Makoni, for inviting me again for the second time to join you here. I have very, very good memories of the first time I was here, and I hope I will have the same experience this time. I will have kind questions from you. Now, before I begin, I should perhaps, um, thank you for allowing me to speak from Basel. If this talk were happening in person, I might have had to check whether ICE considers epistemic trespassing a deportable offense. After all, my colleagues and I have spent the last few years studying Europe, and as you know, studying Europe without permission can be risky business. So let me begin with a story you may know. It is the story of Henrietta Lacks, an African American woman whose cells changed the course of modern medicine. She was born in 1920 and she died in 1951 of cervical cancer. She was treated at Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of the few institutions at the time that admitted Black patients. And during her treatment, doctors removed samples from her tumor without her knowledge or consent. Those cells proved to be extraordinary. They did not die. They reproduced indefinitely in laboratory conditions and became known as the HeLa cells. They were shared worldwide. They were used to test vaccines, to develop in vitro fertilization, and even advanced cancer research. Her family only discovered this decades later. They never received compensation for that. Yet, thanks to those cells, humanity made enormous medical progress, including the development of the polio vaccine, which was eradicated a few years ago. It is at once a story of scientific triumph and a story of moral failure. The world owes much that is good to evil. The foundations of modern knowledge were laid through practices that denied dignity to those who made discovery possible. Now, this story sets the tone for what I wish to discuss today. The project that my colleagues and I called Reversing the Gaze begins from precisely this difficulty, the moral difficulty of knowledge. it asks whether we can turn the moral weight of our histories into an epistemic resource rather than a source of paralysis. So we wanted to move beyond lamentation and develop methods that make curiosity productive again. So our aim was not to moralize science, but to understand its moral ecology, the conditions, the values, and asymmetries that make knowledge possible. So in what follows, I will proceed in 6 steps. I will begin by describing the problem of epistemic asymmetry, that is, how the social sciences were built upon unequal geographies of knowing. Then I will introduce the Reversing the Gaze project itself, which was an experiment in what we call post-comparative area studies. And from there, I will outline my own contribution to the project, the idea of a moral ecology of concepts, which treats concepts as living within moral environments. I will then turn to our collaborative chapter, Communities of Virtue, where we tested this approach by using an African concept, or one that was deployed in Africa. So the concept of retribalization, to study European realities. And finally, I will draw out the implications of this experiment for African studies and close with a reflection on what it means today to learn to know better. So let me start with the epistemic asymmetry in knowledge production. The social sciences were born in the shadow of empire. Their key concepts, so concepts like tribe, development, modernization, progress, culture, civilization, you name them, emerged from Europe's encounter with the rest of the world. They did not simply describe the world, they made it. They decided what counted as intelligible, who could speak, and what forms of life were worthy of analysis. The familiar assumption of universality masked a profound asymmetry. The North theorized, the South was theorized about. As Paulin Untonji, the late philosopher from Benin, famously observed, this arrangement amounted to an international division of intellectual labor. In this division, Africa supplied raw data, so the facts, case studies, and ethnographic curiosities, while Europe refined them into theory. So knowledge followed the same colonial logic as material production. Resources flowed outward, while and value basically flowed back. Valentin Mudimbe, who also passed away recently, in The Invention of Africa, took this diagnosis further by showing how this epistemic order did not merely organize labor, but produce difference itself. So through the concepts of tradition, magic, or tribe, Africa was constituted as the other of reason. So the negative space that allowed Europe to imagine itself as the universal. So what passed for scientific description was in fact a moral and political act of world making. Today, this situation is changing. Across the continent, scholars are re-examining the intellectual heritage of African thought, not to claim exceptionalism, but to reclaim participation in the universal. And the challenge is to move from Africa as an object to Africa as a vantage point, a place from which the human condition can be understood differently. So in the past, African studies was the paradigmatic case of this asymmetry. It emerged not as a space of theoretical invention, but as an object science, a science of observation, a science of description, and a science of classification. So Africa was the laboratory where European concepts were tested, rarely the source from which concepts traveled outward. So reversing the gaze was not an attempt to act on this challenge, not by, it was an attempt to act on this challenge, not by rejecting European thought, but by taking it seriously enough to question its self-evidence. And I should add, since we are in Pennsylvania in the United States, that self-evidence is a dangerous word in this part of the world. Those who signed the Declaration of Independence also believed in self-evident truths. But as history quickly showed, some of those truths were more self-evident for some than for others. Now, our project begins from the same suspicion that what appears self-evident in knowledge is often the product of power, or the product of habit, and even the product of history. So post-colonial and decolonial thinkers have long shown that knowledge has never been innocent. It was not only that Europe colonized the world politically, it also colonized the conditions of intelligibility, deciding what counted as reason, what counted as evidence, and ultimately what counted as truth. So Edward Said exposed how Orientalism, for example, transformed entire regions into objects of moral pedagogy. Spivak warned that the subaltern could not speak within a language that had already defined her as silent. Or Walter Mignolo more recently described modern science as a project of epistemic disobedience, waiting to happen, one that must delink from the imperial geography of reason. And Achille Mbembe reminded us that colonialism was never just an episode of conquest, but a system for organizing who may think and who must be thought about. In this sense, the self-evidence of scientific truth was not self-evidence at all. It was the effect of a long moral pedagogy through which Europe taught the world to see itself through European eyes. So to reverse the gaze, therefore, is to reclaim the right to astonishment, to ask how knowledge became obvious, who paid the price for that obviousness, and what other ways of knowing were silenced in the process. So let me turn to the project itself. And as I said, it began as a collective inquiry among colleagues based in Switzerland, in Germany, and in the UK. And we were dissatisfied with the routine of comparative area studies, which often reproduces the very divisions it seeks to transcend. So that is Africa, Europe, Asia, as if they were natural and self-contained. We wanted to go beyond comparison to explore what happens when concepts forged in one historical and cultural world, that is a European world, are applied to another, in my case, to Africa. So we call this a post-comparative approach. Rather than comparing empirical regions, we compared conceptual work. And our guiding question was quite simple and straightforward. What happens when concepts developed in African contexts are used to make sense of European realities? So in this sense, reversing the gaze was not a moral or political act, but an epistemological experiment, what we called a conceptual laboratory. In this laboratory, concepts were our tools, as it were, and Europe was our field of observation. We did not set out to prove that African thought is superior, for example, or that European social science is flawed. We just wanted to test the scope, or if you like, the limits and the adaptability of concepts themselves. Now, this approach builds on the idea of reciprocal comparison, which was proposed by historians such as Kenneth Pomeranz and Gareth Austin, who argued that African history could serve as a basis for models applicable elsewhere. But we went a step further. We wanted to see whether African concepts could travel, whether they could glorify and not just illustrate what we might agree to call human experience in other parts of the world. So we wanted to see whether African concepts could travel um, and, um, um, and, and basically this is an idea that may sound simple now, but it was not easy to convince others that this was a legitimate research project. So our initial application, for example, here in Switzerland was turned down because the reviewers feared that we lacked the right kind of expertise to study Europe, which for us sounded like a curious objection, since the absence of African expertise has never stopped Europeans from studying Africa, Asia, or Latin America. So we had to insist that our work was not about Europe as a field site, but about concepts as intellectual instruments. So what we proposed was conceptual work, not cultural commentary. What we proposed was, if you like, an epistemological experiment rather than an ethnography. So we were quite delighted when the reviewers finally understood the nature of our undertaking, that one does not need to be an expert on Europe to examine the conceptual scaffolding through which Europe or any place becomes intelligible. And what we sought to test was not our familiarity with the terrain, but the adaptability and analytical strength of the concepts themselves. So to put it in a slightly different way, Reversing the Gaze is a project about epistemic mobility. It is an invitation to free concepts from their original cages and to see theory as human, not a geographical, if you like, achievement. So what do I mean by the moral ecology of concepts? The argument I developed in a chapter from the book that we are preparing that should be coming out next year. I call it the moral ecology of concepts. And it begins from the observation that concepts live in moral environments. Every concept arises in a world of facts, of values, and prescriptions, or recommendations, if you like. It carries moral weight. It tells us not only what is, but also what ought to be. So to use a concept is to take a moral stance, whether or not we are aware of it. And the work of the researcher is never neutral. We mediate between worlds through concepts that describe and judge at once. Consider, for example, what the Nigerian sociologist Oyoronke Oyewomun, who was here last time I spoke to you, demonstrated so powerfully in her book, The Invention of Women. She argues that the very idea of womanhood as a social category is not a universal human constant, but a European invention. In pre-colonial Yoruba society, she notes, social hierarchy was not organized around biological difference, but around age and seniority. So authority derived from temporal maturity, not from sex. And it was colonial modernity that introduced biology, that is the body, anatomy, and reproduction, as the organizing principle of social distinction. And once biology became the key to defining personhood, it also became the language of hierarchy. It also became, if you like, the language of moral order and legitimacy. Now, from this perspective, biology is not merely a descriptive concept, it is a moral one. It tells us not just how bodies differ, but how they ought to matter. It defines normality and deviation, competence and dependency, adulthood and vulnerability. So, when European gender norms were imposed on African societies, they did not simply classify difference. They prescribed an entire moral universe in which bodily attributes or features or properties determined one's place within it. And this is precisely what Oyewumi invites us to see, that what passes as scientific objectivity is often a moral translation of one worldview into another. So to describe societies through biology was to domesticate an unfamiliar world into familiar moral categories. So it was to make African life intelligible by European standards of the body. So concepts in this sense are not innocent. They do not merely mirror reality. They create it in their own moral image. So to analyze this process, I proposed a framework for studying what I call this moral ecology of concept. And the framework has got 6 dimensions. One is origin, so the moral and historical conditions in which a concept was coined. The other one is deployment, the institutions and disciplines that spread it. The third one is reception, the ways it is adopted, resisted, or transformed. The fourth one is moral implications, and that describes the values it prescribes as normal or desirable or even deviant. And the fifth one, the framing effects. So what realities it highlights or silences. And finally, critical assessment, whether it dignifies or diminishes, or whether it clarifies or it obscures. I can illustrate this with an example from my own research and the concept that we were working with. And that concept was the concept of retribalization. Now, the term was coined in mid-20th century anthropology to describe how Africans in urban settings seemed to cling to tribal identities rather than embrace modern individualism. So from the perspective of European modernization theory, this was a failure, a relapse into the past, if you like. But what if we take the concept out of its colonial moral ecology and look at it differently? What if retribalization was not a pathology, but a human response to uncertainty, a way of creating coherence, a way of creating solidarity, and even a way of creating moral order in a world of disruption, such as the colonial world was? Now, in this reframing, retribalization ceases to be an African exception and becomes a general human phenomenon. So when faced with rapid change, people everywhere reaffirm essential categories of belonging. And this reframing also reveals the deeper point of our project on reversing the gaze. We are not simply moving concepts from one place to another. We are re-examining the moral soil in which they grow. And at stake is the very practice of critique. In many strands of post-colonial thought, critique has become inseparable from moral outrage. And outrage is vital as it expresses the injury of misrepresentation. But when outrage becomes the measure of truth, it risks collapsing into cruelty. I use the word cruelty here in the sense given to it by Judith Schklar, in her book, The Worst of the Ordinary Vices. That is the willingness to harm others in the belief that one is right. Academic cruelty happens when we silence disagreement, for example, when we erase flawed thinkers rather than debate them, or when we wield concepts as weapons of moral superiority, which often happens with, especially with immature scholars. Now, Southern critique, that's the argument I would like to make, must resist this temptation. Its task is not to punish science, but to improve it. It must discipline indignation into illumination. It should turn moral passion into conceptual responsibility. So at the heart of what I'm trying to share with you here lies a fundamental distinction between validation on the one hand and truth on the other. Truth, as we often invoke it, belongs to the language of revelation because it closes debate. Validation, by contrast, belongs to the language of method because it opens conversation. To validate knowledge is to expose it to examination or even to risk misunderstanding. And it is also to invite correction. I think it is an act of humility before the complexity of the world. Now, the colonial and post-colonial history of science shows us how dangerous the idea of truth can become when it ceases to be tested. Truth claims have justified domination, they have justified erasure, and even exclusion. Now, validation, on the other hand, demands community. Validation implies that knowledge becomes legitimate not because it triumphs, but because it convinces, because others can follow the path of reasoning, and if necessary, they can improve it. This, I think, is the ethical core of any genuinely decolonial project. The goal is not to replace Western truths with African ones, but to build a community of validation in which different intellectual traditions can test each other's claims without fear or hierarchy. Validation restores science to its proper moral ecology, not as a contest of certainties, but as a practice of mutual accountability. So let me cast a look at what happens when concepts travel. Now, I wrote a chapter in the book that we are preparing together with Winnie Kanyimba and Matthias Ruder, who are my doctoral students who were employed to work on this project. And what we did there was to try and find a way to put this framework into practice. We asked what would happen if we applied the concept of retribalization to European realities. Could it help us to see Europe or Switzerland in a different way? We examined two cases in Switzerland, namely a civic movement which is called Operation Libero, which campaigns for a cosmopolitan understanding of Swiss citizenship, and the debates around municipal marriages in central Switzerland, where small communities were urged to unite in the name of progress. And both contexts revealed the same underlying pattern. First, in the case of Operation Libero, which is really a group of young Swiss activists defending liberal values and open borders, it had to constitute itself as a moral community. Its members were bound together not by interest, but by their commitment to the virtue of openness. Their activism required constant affirmation of what it meant to be liberal, to be tolerant, and to be cosmopolitan. And in this sense, liberalism itself became a kind of tribe, a source of belonging in uncertain times. Second, the controversy of municipal mergers revealed competing moral communities. So supporters of mergers in these small municipalities in Switzerland, they spoke the language of modernization and efficiency. And the opponents spoke of history and attachment, of community. And each side built a community of virtue. So one organized around the value of progress, and the other one organized around the virtue of local belonging. And here again, retribalization, now stripped of its colonial pathology, helps us recognize a universal dynamic. Under conditions of uncertainty, people withdraw into essential categories of virtue. But we must be clear about what this means. Concepts are not in the business of discriminating between superior and inferior forms of life. They are in the business of making human experience intelligible. So a concept such as retribalization does not tell us who is right or wrong, who is modern or traditional, or who is enlightened or backward. Properly used, it tells us how human beings, wherever they are, cope with the fragility of meaning, how they transform anxiety into order, or even belonging and purpose. So in this sense, concepts are moral instruments, but not moralizing instruments. They do not exist to classify people into hierarchies. They exist to describe the ways in which people seek coherence in the face of dislocation. So to speak of retribalization in Switzerland or in South Africa or in Zambia, where the concepts were tested by social anthropologists, is not to accuse, but to illuminate, to reveal the shared grammar of human experience that underlies very different histories. And the strength of a concept lies precisely in its capacity to travel without condemning, to recognize common predicaments without erasing difference. Now, when we remember this, we free the social sciences from their ancient habit of sorting humanity into stages of progress, for example. We return to their more modest and more dignified vocation, which is to understand how people everywhere try to make their worlds livable. This insight has two implications. First, it restores the concept's analytical power by freeing it from its Eurocentric moral charge. Second, it turns African studies into a producer of concepts that explain not only Africa, but the world. And in this sense, to reverse the gaze is actually to make African concepts travel, or to demonstrate that they too can illuminate Europe and by extension, humanity. And this is incidentally the reason why the Center for African Studies here at the University of Basel pursues an intellectual agenda based on a quite straightforward motto: we study Africa to understand the world. Now, what are the implications of this for African studies? I'll now be moving towards the end of my presentation. First, I think this means that Africa is not a problem to be solved, but a resource for thinking. The continent offers not merely data, but conceptual possibilities. And second, it means that knowledge is a shared moral project. The task is not to create a separate epistemology of the South, but to sustain a plural ecology of knowing, where concepts are judged by their capacity to clarify, not by their passport. And third, it means that African studies can become a site of epistemic reciprocity. That is a space where the world is studied through Africa and Africa is studied through the world. This is not a reversal of hierarchy for its own sake. It is an act of intellectual solidarity, a recognition that to know better, we must sometimes begin elsewhere. And what I mean by this is what we might call epistemic reciprocity. Knowledge, in its best sense, is not a monologue, but a conversation. It is a moral exchange between different ways of making the world intelligible. And reciprocity does not require symmetry, and it certainly does not erase difference. It simply requires that we allow the other to surprise us, to correct us, and to expand the range of what we can understand. In the history of science, reciprocity has often been replaced by extraction. So we extract ideas, data, and cultural materials. Um, we know this, these were taken from one context and processed into theory elsewhere. Epistemic reciprocity reverses that flow without reproducing its violence. It means that every intellectual tradition, whether it is African, European, Asian, or whatever, must learn to see itself as both observer and observed, teacher and student, interpreter and interpreted. Seen in this light, concepts become diplomatic instruments of understanding. They move across worlds not to dominate, but to translate. They move across worlds not to establish who is right, but to expand the circle of intelligibility. And ultimately, they remind us that all knowledge is local until it is shared, and that it becomes universal only when it learns to listen. So epistemic reciprocity is not about who studies whom. It is about the willingness to expose one's categories to the judgment of others, to let one's concepts be tested, to let one's concept be stretched or even undone by unfamiliar experiences. And in that sense, reversing the gaze, our project, is not an epistemological revolution, but a moral apprenticeship. It is a way of learning to know better by allowing others to know with us. So to close this, let me return briefly to Henrietta Lacks. Her cells continue to live in laboratories across the world. They are still multiplying and they are still producing knowledge. Her story reminds us that knowledge is never pure. It is always entangled with moral ecologies. And what we learn from her and from reversing the gaze is that the work of critique cannot stop at denunciation. It must move toward clarification. To reverse the gaze is not for Africa to stare back at Europe in anger, but for humanity to learn to look at itself differently, concept by concept, virtue by virtue. And that's a modest ambition, to practice science without cruelty, to cultivate critique without arrogance, and to restore to curiosity its moral dignity. And that, to me, is what post-comparative African studies means. Not a new geography of knowledge, but a new ecology of responsibility, a moral ecology of knowledge. So I'm really relieved to be online because if I had landed at JFK carrying African concepts to study Europe, oh, I'm sure US Customs might have stopped me at the airport. They might have asked me anything to declare, and I might have had to say yes, a few mid-range concepts and a moral ecology. And that could have taken hours to explain. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Macamo. I now welcome Professor Makoni for discussion with you. Professor Makoni, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Macamo. Let me start a conversation with you and see where we go from there. If I were to say to you that I wanted to study African studies in Pennsylvania, I want to see to what extent concepts that are in circulation in African studies are utilizable in Pennsylvania. Will that be part of reversing the gaze for you, where the argument is you can study Africa in Pennsylvania?
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I think I got you. No, thank you. I think that's a very, very good question, to the extent that it helps me to make a few points clearer that may not have been clear in my presentation. So I think there are two things at issue here. One issue is whether concepts have a nationality or an origin tag, meaning the idea that certain concepts can only be used in certain contexts. And I would say that that has been a major methodological issue in the social sciences as applied to non-European concepts. I think there's always been a kind of bias, an assumption that there are certain concepts that can only be used in Africa. So the concept of retribalization, for example, as deployed by social anthropologists, and that because of that, concepts cannot be applied at random anywhere. So there's that one difficulty, and our project actually argues against that. We say while concepts may have an origin, if we want to use them as scientific tools, they have to be able to be used elsewhere, of course, with the right kind of adaptation, right? So there are no boundaries to concepts. So that's the first issue. The second issue, which goes to the heart of what we were trying to do, because we tried to demonstrate that. So we took concepts. I spoke mainly about retribalization, a concept that was used by social anthropologists in Zambia, in South Africa, you know, to describe these, you know, modernization processes in the context of colonialism. So these people who were moving into towns, and colonial authorities found that instead of becoming cosmopolitan, they were going back to their primordial identities. And so they coined that specific term, retribalization. But we also used other concepts in our larger project. So there is the concept of political society, which was introduced by an Indian scholar, or I'm forgetting his name now, but it was used by colleagues of mine in their work package. So they brought that concept from India to study politics in Austria, yeah, within the same project. So they claimed, you know, because the idea was that civil society is a concept that cannot do justice to the particular conditions of developing countries or non-European societies. And therefore, we need a concept like political society. And so my colleague said, we will use that concept to study Austria, right? Especially right-wing political parties in Austria, which argue, within the conceptual boundaries of the idea of political society, and so on. We had several concepts such as
Like
those.
that. Okay.
And so what we were doing was actually to try and show that if you do the right kind of conceptual work, you can be able to apply concepts anywhere. And that there is a lot to gain from harnessing all the knowledge that was produced about Africa, to other places. So, for example, in my project, what we were able to establish is something that Swiss political science has not been able to understand, which is that in debates about migration, really what is at stake is the idea of citizenship and how citizenship is taught here in Switzerland, and that the kind of response people in Switzerland have to migration, is the same kind of response you have elsewhere to conditions of uncertainty. And so there's value in using the knowledge that we have acquired in Africa and applying it, if you like, to the North. It's a way, Professor Makone, that's my last point. It's really a way of making the case that we shouldn't just study Africa for the sake of studying Africa. We should study Africa so that we can make a contribution towards understanding human nature. And if we can develop good concepts in Africa, there's no reason why we should not try to apply them where we are.
There are two things that I want to say, and then we can continue the conversation. I hear you. For me, you study Africa because you want to use Africa as an analytical prism to understand other disciplines. So, for example, in the discipline that Lynn Mario and myself and others who are here are part of, my argument is I spent time in African studies because I think the concepts in African studies may re-energize an ailing applied linguistics.
Yes.
So that is my argument about that. Right. So it's more or less like saying the argument I make to myself and to my students when they bother listening to me is that applied linguistics can't revive itself. It needs to be revived by concepts from elsewhere. It needs a completely different way of thinking about it. Right. That argument of, let's say, Africa is an analytical prism, that I buy. What I've been struggling with, it would be interesting to hear what my other colleagues here think about it. I'm not completely convinced you can separate the analyst from the concept. Right. The significance of a particular concept, let's just say multilingualism, when it is articulated by Lynn Mario, carries completely different meanings from when it is articulated, let's say, by another white scholar. In other words, I'm struggling to find a way of surgically separating the concept from the analyst. The person who is articulating, who is making the argument. That's why not everyone can make the same argument across the board with equal legitimacy. Right. Right. That I do like the idea of concepts moving around, etc., etc. But there is something called legitimacy in who is making the case.
Okay. Yeah.
right? Who
Yeah.
is making the case? So that I
Yeah.
think is one of the problems that I am sort of I think some of my colleagues will come in and they'll talk about their own views about this. But I also
Right.
agree with you that the aim is towards building a more global understanding of knowledge. My view about, let's say, universality, et cetera, is as follows. I object to imperial universality, which means one view, one type of knowledge created by one particular person applicable across the world.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a part of me that says what we are all trying to contribute towards is the creation of an egalitarian globality of knowledge.
Yeah.
Right. We are all contributing in our own different ways towards creating that type of knowledge. And within that globality of knowledge, for me, Switzerland and Pennsylvania are the geographical sites I want to study.
Okay.
Because that politically enables me to
Yeah.
completely reverse the process,
Yeah.
to let
Yeah.
my colleagues get a feel of what it means to be the objects of study.
Yeah.
Right, to completely reverse the entire process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, no, I agree with you
Mm,
on the first and second
mm,
and third point. We have to discuss your second
yeah.
point. But
Mm,
on these 2 points, I really agree with you because this is exactly what we wanted to do.
mhm.
I mean, and this is why um, when we first submitted the project, the application, it was rejected
Mm,
because, I mean, none of us had any pedigree in doing research in Europe. So we were
mm,
doing our research in Switzerland, in Austria, and in Italy. These
mhm,
were our research sites,
mhm.
and none of us had any kind of experience in doing research there. All of us, grew up uh,
Yes.
professionally doing research outside of Europe, right?
Mm,
So it was also to return
mhm.
that feeling,
Yeah, yes.
and that's why we emphasize, this
Yes.
gaze,
Yes.
reversing the
The
gaze,
game. Yes.
not just the look, but the gaze. We
Yes.
are looking at them in an intensive way,
Yes.
right? So that's very important. But let me react to your uh, doubts and hesitations cause concerning the distinction, where whether we can separate the analyst from the concept.
Uh-huh.
There's something in me
Uh-huh.
that says you've got a point,
Uh-huh.
and I tried to deal with that
Uh-huh.
through the idea that there is a moral ecology to concepts,
Okay.
you know,
Okay.
um, that is, uh, so beyond debates about objectivity and so
Yeah.
on,
Yeah.
really, that concepts reflect experience.
Yes.
Concepts are always a reflection on experience, and experience is not just
Uh-huh.
empirical,
Mhm.
physical. It is also moral. It's
Yes.
normative, right? So when you use a concept,
Mm-hmm.
whether you are aware of it or not, you
Mm-hmm.
are also taking on board
The worldview.
its
Yeah.
normative charge.
Yes.
That's inevitable.
Yes.
So by really trying to reflect on what I call their moral ecology,
Uh-huh.
I was trying to find a way of, bringing that to the fore,
Uh-huh.
acknowledging that and not hiding behind this usual trick
Mm, mm,
we hide behind. Say, oh, I'm just being objective. No, but,
mm, mm,
acknowledge that concepts do have that, right?
mm,
So where I would still have to think seriously,
mm-hmm.
you know, in reaction to your challenge, and I may not be able to give you a satisfactory answer now, is whether that moral charge is inevitably bound with the person who uses it, right? So such that, you know, you can make that remark you made, that it's one thing for Professor Sinfrey Makoni or Professor Lynn de Souza to say multilingualism, and it is a completely different thing from a moral point of view for Noam Chomsky to use that word. I would say, you know, if we describe science as a kind of commitment towards intelligibility, we may have to soften that. Yeah, we may have to soften that, because otherwise, I don't see how we could be able to claim that we can have a rational conversation amongst us, you know, and still claim to understand one another. I mean, I'm reminded here of the late Kwasi Wiredu, the Ghanaian philosopher, who talked about untranslatability, right? But he didn't mean to say that you cannot translate one concept in one language to another language. What he meant to say was that in order for us to be able to translate, we have to come to the limits of our understanding. So we have to move beyond what is familiar. And I think that is the challenge. I think the difficulty, for example, I have, or I would have, in claiming that, you know, a German scholar or a white American scholar could use concepts the same way I use them, would be precisely that the person is operating from a social and moral context that is familiar to him. And so if that person is never challenged to question what is familiar to them, then they might never appreciate the meaning of what I'm saying, right? So let me maybe give you another example, and then I stop here. For the past 4 years or 5 years, I had been engaged in a project together with a colleague and friend of mine from the University of Frankfurt, Mamadou Jawara. And we had a project, and in that project, what we were doing was to train young university professors from Francophone West Africa. So we picked up 15 scholars, and we had funding to set up what we called a pilot academy of postgraduate African studies. And over a period of 4 years, you know, we would meet twice a year in Bamako, in Mali, for 2 weeks, and we would discuss, you know, conceptual issues. And one outcome of that project is a book that is in preparation now. It's not yet published, but it will be published next year. And in that book, what we do, we invited the scholars who are from different disciplines, psychology, sociology, anthropology, law, and so on. We invited them to take a basic concept from their discipline. So sociologists could take the concept social fact or social action, and then translate that concept into their mother tongue, right? And then reflect on the difficulty of doing that work of translation, right? The idea being that we often face this problem where young scholars in Africa studying sociology, or anthropology, or political science, or whatever you want to call the disciplines, and they basically take these concepts, use them simply as mechanical tools, and never reflect on their genealogy, their history. And that history carries those moral things that concepts have with them. And then when they apply it to their circumstances, those concepts become normative. So, you know, if you take political science and you want to describe the state in Africa, what you describe is failure, right? Because that is embedded in the concepts that political science uses, if you're not critical about them, right? But even there, my commitment is to the idea of intelligibility, you know? So I'm not translating, and I'm not asking these young scholars to translate concepts so that they become unintelligible to others, but it is to make them more intelligible. And perhaps our European colleagues will find in those translations ways of expanding their original concepts. Yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
Let me then say the last thing, then I'll hand over to Messi. I hear you, as they would say. But this is where my thinking goes. Once you start playing around and using concepts in their moral ecology, and you spend years, etc., working with them, they change you. You exit a very different person from what you were when you started working with those particular concepts. In other words, you were using the word reciprocity. There is a reciprocal, mutual changes that take place.
Yeah.
The student who starts talking about a particular concept, let's say Afrocentricity, coloniality, when they start, by the time they exit their PhD, they have been changed partially by that concept. In other words, the concepts are not like at Walmart. You buy them, you get them, you use them, and you go away. They they begin to have a life of their own. They connect you to other people, and they change you in the same process. So it is that the tendency for us to be changed by what we study. That's why, for me, for example, the applied linguists who study psychology of language are fundamentally a different group of people from those that study the politics of language, right? Because they are changed by the discipline that they look at. So it's not simply a question of comparing disciplines. These are fundamentally different orientations. So anyway, let me stop. Let me give over to Messi and to allow other people to we will talk. Messi, Lynn Mario wants to talk.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Macamo, we'll talk more. We'll talk.
Yeah, Lynn Mario, if you have a question, you can go ahead.
Well, it's not really a question, but it's probably an expansion on what Sintri and Elísio have just been discussing. Elísio, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro.
Yeah.
So he doesn't actually talk about a reverse anthropology, but he talks about changing the perspective in anthropology from the colonizing perspective to the, let's say, the native perspective or the indigenous perspective, which is the term he uses. So basically, he's not looking for a substitution, a reversal, but a coexistence side by side, right? Which is, and I read you by saying that as saying something very similar. So we're not actually reversing the gaze. What we're doing, and pardon me for using a very liberal term, we are pluralizing the gaze, right?
Okay.
And promoting, as Boaventura de Sousa Santos conceives, an ecology of knowledges. So we're not replacing colonial knowledges with local knowledges. We're saying what was missing with colonial knowledges is the coexistence of local knowledges, right?
Yeah.
And that is where I think here, recuperating now Frantz Fanon's concept of lived experience is extremely important. And I think this is what Sintri was kind of pointing towards, the experience of the analyst, right? Because what Fanon saw that he could not get from psychotherapy, which was Freudian at the time, let's say European, right, was the lived experience of the word you use, cruelty, or the word Fanon uses is violence, right? The violence of colonization, right? That is not, if you don't take into account the lived experience of the colonized, the psychotherapy which comes and looks at trauma as being at the cognitive individual level is lost, right? So besides the cognitive individual level, which is the conceptual or the level, we have the historical, social, collective level, which is what he calls sociogeny, or I would say lived experience. And this is where, in my work, I talk about the locus of enunciation of the analyst.
Oh, okay.
Right, is extremely important, because that is constituted of our lived experiences, which include not just our academic libraries, but also our lived experiences, right? And you know, referring to Sintri and myself, I mean, you know, there is a difference between us who were born during the colonial period, right? And so we have experienced the violence and the cruelty of colonization on our skins. And my personal experiences of British colonization and Portuguese colonization, right? So it's difficult for me just to see this as an academic enterprise, right? So when you talk about the epistemic reciprocity as being allowing the other to surprise us, but we are from the generation where, you know, the gaze of the other surprised us into silence and non-existence. So, you know, we have tried to reverse the reversal of the gaze, right? In our work, and now what you're saying is we're you know, it's another level of reversal, right? And in fact, Eliseo, we are going through this at the moment in Brazil. I mean, we've spent the last 20 years talking about Southern epistemologies and decolonization of knowledge, and through Vives de Castro, this conception of multinaturalism and not multiculturalism, right? Where so, and now when I'm at present supervising a postdoctoral research in the very north of Brazil, in Amapá, which is where the Brazilian government has opened up the possibility of the national financial exploitation of offshore petrol, right?
Okay.
And this is going to have extreme effects on that region, which is populated still. It's the Amazonian region populated by indigenous cultures and peoples, right? And so our outrage from the urban academies of the Southeast, right, 4,000 kilometers away. Now, when we go up there and express our outrage and try to understand the local perspective, what comes back to us is that, you know, they tell us, just a minute, we also want a slice of the national cake of wealth, right? Stop telling us how we should protect our traditions, right? We are interested in progress and modernity. Now, suddenly, Yeah.
Yeah.
We have the reversal of the reversal. Right? They are telling us you are stop. Go back. We want colonization.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we have to take a stance where we cannot adopt a position of preaching, because suddenly that's how we were perceived.
Yeah.
We were preaching to them to be careful. Suddenly we realized that our critical stance could not be that, but to listen. And we could collaborate by listening. And at the moment, we are in a position where we see we cannot stop the process which has already been triggered, right?
Yeah.
They want, those indigenous communities want that progress, which we have spent decades criticizing. They want that modernity, right?
Yeah.
So they are questioning our morality, and they're teaching us something about a different kind of morality, which has probably built on all our reservations about progress and modernity. So perhaps it's not the same.
Yeah.
These are not the same views of progress and modernity that we had.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we are now being forced to take a stance where we cannot stop.
Yeah.
We cannot stop the, let's say, the disaster from our perspective, of course, which is about to happen. But we can learn from it and minimize future similar disasters.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I wonder what you could say about this.
No, I mean, thank you so much for those thoughts. They do indeed expand on some of the things that I had in mind here. I like your idea of a locus of enunciation, because I think this is what it boils down to. Of course, my qualification to that is that I have a desire that my locus of enunciation can accommodate others. That is, I don't want to keep it to myself, but I want other people to also be able to speak from where I am speaking. So I'm picking up on coming back to that idea of intelligibility, which I think is so central to how I think about science. So, I mean, what you are saying about how, how we can be at loggerheads as researchers with the people whose lives we think we want to improve. I don't think it's just a conceptual problem. I think it's a methodological problem, right? Because it challenges us to reflect on how we come to the to the idea that we may be right concerning what we are saying. How can we make that claim if the people whose lives we think we want to improve are thinking in a completely different way? No, you come back perhaps to this old Marxist problem of false consciousness, and maybe you don't want to go down that road. You don't want to say to people that somehow they have false consciousness, they don't know what is right for them, and I will teach them. It becomes quite colonial somehow, that attitude. But when I say that this is methodological, I mean, I'm now speaking from my experience as someone who's been teaching for so many years, supervising MA students and PhD students and postdoctoral students, and finding out again and again that one of the biggest challenges we face is to bring students to accept that it is possible to establish that an argument is wrong without having to appeal to my values or to my politics, right? That is a big challenge. And my experience tells me, I mean, it's not a losing battle, but it's hard. So it's so, because it's so easy when you appeal to emotions, when you appeal to politics, it's so easy to win an argument, right? And so the locus of enunciation in less careful hands can be used as a resource for the validation of things that may not be worth, what we think they are. And so that is why I think opening that up, or holding the promise that other people can come to, they can join me there. And then out of that, we can develop criteria based on which we can decide what's right and what's wrong, or what's valid. Let me put it that way. What is valid and what is not valid. I think that's a worthwhile enterprise. So thank you again.
Can I just come back to you on that?
Yeah.
Sorry. Here in Brazil, we've begun to make a distinction between, it doesn't come out well in English, between locus of enunciation and what we call local de fala.
Okay. Yeah.
It's basically, it's the place we're speaking from in both cases.
Yeah.
Locus of enunciation is more complex, where it says we are constituted by multiple discourses, and these discourses are constantly changing, and these discourses may short circuit each other, right? So we are constantly learning from the discourses that constitute us. It's not fixed.
Yeah.
Whereas lugar de fala, which is literally the place I'm speaking from, is a space used politically by minority groups, especially by the anti-racist movements in Brazil, and the feminist movements. It's basically a political construct, and it's representational. So that's where it's unchanging, because you are occupying a specific position of representation. So we make that slight distinction. One is political and unchanging, whereas the other one is complex. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine, and I think it makes sense as well to make that distinction. It's a useful one. I'm reminded here of early post-colonial work. Can the subaltern speak? Spivak, right? And of course, maybe in those days that was really the question, but I think it became apparent in the course of time that the question was not whether the subaltern can speak, but whether the subaltern can be heard.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That was the question. And so the distinction you make between the locus of enunciation and the locus of speech, let me translate it in that way, or the place from which we speak, right? I think it's a useful one in the sense that it helps us to go back to those discussions, and with the benefit of hindsight, specify them even more, right? But it all comes down, to me at least, it all comes down to the much bigger question concerning how we validate truth claims, right? I think that is the question. And maybe we will have to acknowledge that there may be contexts where the validation of claims will have to respond to criteria that perhaps have little to do with scientific criteria. Why not? Right? So maybe you know, Boaventura Sousa Santos' idea of an ecology of knowledges and so on, is a useful way of thinking about that. That maybe we have systems of knowledge out there that will have to create their own rules of validation. And maybe these rules of validation cannot be, I don't know, transferred easily from one context or from one system to another. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think I'm having like a couple of questions from you from the chat box. So one is a comment from Dorothy. She's saying, thank you, Professor Macamo. I look forward to reading more of your work. And then I have a question from Beth. This is a very interesting presentation. The concept of tribe itself has a pretty troublesome history. This concept, developed in Europe, was used in a particular way for the study of Africa. That way has not really been reapplied to the study of Europe. Wouldn't it be also an idea to see to what extent the concept retains its validity if applied into Europe, and what that again means for the use of concept on Africa? So
Yeah.
I think, Beth, if you're around, yeah, you can respond to that, or if I haven't read it very well, maybe she can elaborate it further. Yeah.
Okay.
Beth, you can ask your question, perhaps.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, so the word retribalization, of course, has the word tribe in it. And,
Yes.
it's a concept that's by no means neutral in its application to Africa, of course.
Mhm.
And it often has, of course, a number of negative and strange connotations, as Edgar has also pointed out in the chat box. So I was wondering if you if you use that word or a derivation of that in a Swiss context or in an Austrian context, does that teach you some things about the way it has been used in trying to know and understand Zambia, for example? In that sense, there's another reversal there, perhaps, because we like to reverse all reversals.
No, that's a great question. In fact, that was the idea, or at least one of the ideas, right? Because of course, I mean, we are aware of the very polemical and controversial nature of the concept of retribalization, because it draws precisely from tribe. So let me reflect a little bit on that. What actually happened was that a concept that was actually normal in Europe, it was deployed to describe communities, ethnic communities in Europe. When it crossed, when it traveled to, other parts of the world, it acquired a negative meaning because it came to be a signifier of lack of progress, so of tradition, of failure to modernize. So that is why, from a colonial policy point of view, it was such an effective concept, to describe Africans, because with that you could fix their condition as non-modern people. Mahmoud Mamdani, his book on the citizen and subject describes that process quite well. When he makes this distinction between the citizen and subject. So subject as an individual is not the carrier of rights, but of custom. So tribe describes that. Where I come from, Mozambique, I mean, when the Portuguese authorities in the late 19th century tried to formulate their colonial policy, they went to South Africa to get everything that South Africans had done about Bantu people, you know, and they use that. I mean, their claim was this applies to every tribe in the world, right? So you can take any customary law by tribes, and it will apply to any tribe, at least at any rate in Southern Africa. So, I mean, of course, we were aware of the etymology of the word tribe. Now, of course, social anthropologists, when they said retribalization, again, they were emphasizing that there is a kind of refusal by Africans to become modern. Yeah, so it was very negative. The idea of retribalization was a very negative one. And that is perhaps one reason why at first we didn't get funding for this, because people thought, you know, we want to come and describe people here in Europe as tribes. But that's what we ended up doing, right? By showing that there is a process of retribalization in the way that they react to migration, that their concept of citizenship is not the liberal concept of citizenship that, you know, we think that all Europeans subscribe to, but it's particularism, you know. So it's tribalism in that very negative sense in which it was used in Africa. And so our claim in that respect was to say, rather than focusing too much on the concept itself, let us focus on what it allows us to say about how human beings react to circumstances, right? And so that was the point about people reacting to uncertainty by creating communities of virtue, right? So we are special. You know, we have something to protect. And, you know, this is our way of being in the world. So that is what we learned from that.
Thank you. We have Ashraf. You have raised your hand. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. This year, Professor. This year, I think it's the second encounter. Yes, it's very interesting. You know, when we talk about concepts, and I find the project actually exciting. To have Africa, to have Europe as an object of gaze or analysis. The question here which I have is what makes a particular concept African?
Yeah.
We need to avoid this sense of stuff.
Yeah.
And the second point is about the impression which someone can get from the presentation is that the difference between the North and the South is reduced to conceptual difference. Where's the ontological dimension? Yeah.
Okay.
The third question, okay, these two questions. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, don't make my life too hard with too many questions, too many challenging questions. Right. But I think these are very good questions again, because they do help in clarifying things that may not have been clear in the presentation. So actually, we don't claim that there are African concepts or European concepts, right? From an analytical point of view. From a discursive point of view, of course there are. You know, in everyday language, we can say, yeah, that's a Chinese concept. That's a European concept, yeah? But if we use the concept of concept in a rigorous manner, I think we are better off making claims like, you know, a scientific concept, right? Or a concept that we can work with, something like that in research. Yeah. So, for example, retribalization of course, it is not an African concept. And we make it clear in the project that what we were looking for was for concepts that were thought to only be applicable outside of Europe. Yeah. And so that is the sense in which we are saying retribalization is an African concept, right? But for example, in the case of the other colleagues we had colleagues working on Italy, the relationship between Italy and the European Union, right? So how Italy used structural funds and so on. And the concept they were working with was coined by a good friend of mine, a very good Indian scholar, Shalini Randeria, right? She's an anthropologist. And she used the concept of the cunning state, yeah, to describe how India related to its donors, right? So basically, it's the idea of a state that fakes fragility and vulnerability in order to get assistance from donors, right? And so the colleagues use that concept of the cunning state to study the relationship of Italy to the European Union. Again, so maybe that's the closest we came to, if you like, an Indian concept, because it was coined by an Indian scholar. But if you were to be rigorous about that, maybe an Indian concept, had to have some Hindu stuff in it. It has to have, some Indian history in it, and so on, and so on, and so on. So when we say African concept, what we mean is a concept that was thought to be only applicable in the African continent. And so retribalization was one such concept. And that is why we were challenging that concept in our research, by showing that we can use it to good effect in doing research in Switzerland. Now, I think I agree with you with the second point you made. I was indeed concentrating on the conceptual level in looking at the relationship between the South and the North. But of course, history, of course, power, all other relevant things play a role. And that is something that became clear in our work through this prism of the moral ecology of concepts, because all that stuff about history, about power, unequal relations, and so on comes into view. So we don't neglect that,
Yeah, so because of the interest of time, I think I allow one question from Vanessa. Yeah, she'll be the last one to ask the question. Yeah.
I re-tribalize every Friday when I come here. And to me, the re-tribalization is what you mentioned earlier. It's a sense of belonging. So it doesn't matter where the term comes from. Belonging is always very important to me wherever I am. I think interconnectivity is a word that's resonated with me since I was a child. And right now I sit with the paradox of this interconnectivity, and going back to what Macamo had said about separating the concept from the analyst, which threw me into, we live in a compare and contrast world. I mean, everything is compared and contrasted with something else. So my question is, looking at the language of hierarchy, which no matter what I do, I simply cannot get away from. So how do we move away from the describe and prescribe? From your point of view, when you talked about creating concepts, the framing effect. So how could I look at the language of hierarchy within your framing effect idea to sort of deconstruct it? I don't know if that's clear or not.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that's a great observation. Of course, there are two sides to it, or two levels. So there's one level, which is that, I mean, it's not concepts themselves that are the carriers of, let us say, inequality, or, of those hierarchies you're talking about. But it is, the users of concepts and the social context within which users use concept that require those hierarchies or create those hierarchies. So I think part of what we are doing as scholars and researchers, in doing conceptual clarification, especially if you take my suggestion that there is a moral ecology to concept, then part of what we are doing is actually to make people aware of how concepts can be misused as a function of the social position of the people who use them, right? And so if we can expose that, that is, I think that is a way actually of dealing with what you quite aptly described as the tension between description and prescription, because prescription comes or happens because of the normative charge of concepts, right? So if we expose them, right, we can go a long way towards showing that if you use concepts in an uncritical way, you are using them to frame, narratives, right? So, I mean, Vanessa, take something as easy or as straightforward as the state. Yeah, it's a basic concept in political sociology or in political science, right? And we all use it. But consider the normative charge of that concept. Consider the fact that by becoming independent, African countries actually had to accept to be defined and judged against, the background of whatever is in the concept of the state, such that, when you become independent, your main problem is not to it's not to meet the needs, the material needs of your people. It is to live up to the notion of the state, and that is very difficult because of its normative charge. So I think what you are really remarking upon is a very, very important issue we have to grapple with. That and that is why I was insisting on this idea that doing science and doing research is really doing conceptual work. As the great Cameroonian philosopher Ebusi Bulaga used to say, if we want to survive, we have to start to philosophize in earnest. Yeah, that is it. So if we really want to survive, we have to do real conceptual work.
Yeah.
I guess the framing from the internal versus the external is where I get stuck.
Yeah.
Because from the external, it seems much simpler. Internally, because it's so individual, it's making a leap that I just can't, my mind does not encompass.
I think Professor Macamo will help you there.
So,
and Lynn Mario, because they're talking about this locus of enunciation and that kind of stuff. But I see the difficulty. I appreciate it. It's a but you see, maybe one, sorry, Mercy,
It's okay, go
maybe
ahead.
one thing that we can add to this discussion is intellectual humility. Yeah, intellectual humility, which for me means several things, chief among which is the idea that, you know, we shouldn't take us too seriously, right? We shouldn't do that. We should acknowledge that we can get things wrong, and we often do, right? And we stand to be corrected. And so maybe that internal demand that you are making will only be possible if, you know, it is accompanied by intellectual humility. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, we have a question from Charlene. Charlene, could you go ahead? You had written something on the chat box.
Thanks for allowing me the extra time. I don't want to turn on my video, but I guess I should. Yeah, I'm not in the field that you're discussing at all. I'm an ordinary teacher of language, and I'm thinking when one of the most fundamental ways of us expressing our concepts is proverbs.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
and when we say something, it's always connected directly to a place, a landscape, a person, a body, you know, so that the whole idea of language itself, it's not just in the head. So I totally agree with Professor Maconi at the beginning when he said, you can't separate the person from the concept. You can't separate the body of people out of which that concept emerged from the concept. So I'm not disagreeing with anybody or agreeing with anybody. I'm just having that as a thought.
Well, okay, to respect your mood, I won't disagree with you. I will not agree with you either. I think what you're saying is quite relevant, actually. And in fact, I like your reference to Proverbs.
Yes.
Because, for example, the way I teach theory here is actually by saying to students, you know, we theorize every day. You know, we theorize every day. When you use proverbs, you are theorizing. Because what is a proverb? A proverb is an idea that helps you organize facts. And that's what theories do. And in fact, one exercise I often do with students is to say to them, look, I mean, to African students, is to say to them now, okay, now you've got this sociological theory. Now think about a proverb in your language that describes that theory. And it's been a fascinating exercise because often students come up with a proverb that is quite close to that, right? Because proverbs are theories, right? If you know, if students can understand that you have facts, but that facts on their own are not enough, you need the ideas that will help you to organize those facts, then they will understand a lot about what we do in science. Two more things on that. One is that, I mean, this might not be so obvious in disciplines like sociology or linguistics or political science, but, you know, take law. You know, law is based on proverbs. You know, all those references to Latin phrases, all those Latin phrases are basically proverbs. And this is how law works, right? So that's one thought. And the second thought I wanted to share with you is that proverbs are intelligible. You know, so if I use a proverb, from my language, I can use a proverb from my language in an alien context, people will understand what I mean. I'll give you an example. I was once giving a talk on development aid in Germany. Yeah, I mean, it was about unequal relations and so on. And so I gave them a Kenyan proverb. And I said, well, there's a Kenyan proverb that says, frowning frogs will not prevent cows from drinking water from the pond. They understood it. They understood I was talking about dependency and about the powerlessness of those who receive development aid. So again, much as I agree with the idea that the analyst is married to the concept, I still want to emphasize that there is intelligibility. We have to take intelligibility seriously. And that actually, it does not undermine the idea that, there's this unity, organic unity, but it definitely opens up the possibility that it may open up as well.
Okay, thank you so much,
Thank you
Professor
too.
Macamo, for your thoughtful remarks. Professor Makoni, if you have anything to say before we finalize the recorded version.
No, I want to thank Macamo for this wonderful conceptual discussion of concepts. And then again, to remind people that tomorrow we have a Saturday session in honor of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So Mercy, who is going to distribute the flyers?
Yeah, so you'll be getting emails from Amazing, and
Okay.
our speaker for tomorrow, in a nutshell, she's Professor Miriam Maranga Musonye from University of Nairobi, and her topic will be on reimagining knowledge from the road, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and the epistemology of movement. So that will be the topic of discussion.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Vicky, since you are in Kenya, I hope to see you tomorrow. So let's say thank you again to Macamo.
Yeah, I'll be listening.
I'll be listening. Okay. Now, Macamo, we are now getting into what is called the after party.
Yes.
A lot of our colleagues here, some of whom